Well, we're at a kind of a funny crossroads in the world. Just the accidents of happenstance. We're in the we're constantly in an opioid scare and confusion. But Hulu's just released, and we've discussed, although neither of us had seen it, um, Dope Sick, and it's promulgating the myth of the inevitable addictiveness of opioids in its newest guise, although it's going back to OxyContin. So, ironically, at the very same time, there's been a conclusion of a trial which tries all of the fundamental claims in a court of law made by Hulu and Dope Sick. And we're going to talk about one person in particular who's kind of famous. The decision hinged around her. Her name is Anna Lemke. Let's start off with the decision. Drug makers not liable for California opioid crisis, judge finds. 4 communities in California sued drug companies other than Purdue. And, they want to charge them for costs of people who've become addicted to prescribed opioid medications. California communities failed during a landmark trial this year to show that 4 major drug makers are liable for an epidemic of opioid abuse, a Golden State judge wrote in an opinion released last Monday. The court, I think that was the Monday of last week, the week before this past week. The court finds that plaintiffs have failed to prove an actionable public nuisance for which defendants are legally liable. Judge Wilson wrote in a 42-page decision. How do you think people react to this in the general community, in the media community, in the drug policy reform communities?
I think that they'll react to this the same way that liberals, of which I'm one, reacted to Trump being elected president. I think it's like, how can this can't happen? I mean, there might be some sense of denial there too, or demonization of this judge. He must be in their pockets.
Yes. So let's get into Dr. Lemke, Dope Sick, and the truth. In a sense, the trial was a trial of the accuracy of Dope Sick. That's sort of what it was. And the losing card was Lemke. That the judge and there's a defense lawyers presented the anti-Dope Sick Anna Lemke case.
Let me say it a different way, just to
go ahead. Tell me out.
Dope Sick is a series based on this intuition, I guess, or the story that we have all told about what an opioid crisis is, and that pharmaceutical companies caused it, and that drugs addict people. People just kind of believe that, so it's easy enough to make a knockout show about that concept, as though the show is sort of part fiction, but all, historical fiction, let's say. And Anna Lemke is a Stanford psychiatrist who just has perpetuated that myth to death, or continues to perpetuate it. And she was a key witness in this trial saying drugs do addict people. And I'll let you get to the details.
We're going to get to some of her places. She's pervasive. She's the single spokesperson. Mm-hmm. And so she testified for the, it's a civil trial. Right. So they're the plaintiffs seeking damages. And then the lawyers are for the defense. And I guess apropos of how you think people will react, I think they'll be like, oh my God, these defense lawyers and any experts they present. Mm-hmm. what scum of the earth, progressives believe in the court system, like everybody else, until a decision comes down, which contradicts what they believe. And this contradicts 1,000% what they believe.
Yeah.
So one of the lawyers is named Houston, Hueston. What were some of the most important or key cross-examinations during the plaintiff's case from your perspective? This is an interview of the key lawyers. First, Houston. What were the key cross-examinations during the plaintiff's case? Houston, one was of Stanford professor Anna Lemke. Dr. Lemke was presented as the lead voice by the plaintiffs for their case trying to establish misstatements that drove the crisis in California. So the plaintiff's case is that apropos, which is what drug sick is about, dope sick is about, they misrepresented what their drug does. Mm-hmm. And of course, what everybody claims and what everybody claims to believe, although they don't really believe it, because it's not true, is, they give you these painkillers and then you become addicted to it. They just give you them. Maybe they give you too many or make you take them for too long. Dr. Lemke was presented as the lead voice by the plaintiffs for their case trying to establish misstatements that drove the crisis in California. And through methodical undermining, through the cross-examining of each of these alleged statements, showing that in many cases, the statements she said were not made by us, or that she simply construed the statement to be something else. I think it was a true turning point. We're going to talk about Anna Lemke. Anna Lemke is the head of the addiction program at Stanford University Medical School. And what they're going to say is everything she said was false and fabricated. Mm-hmm. Cobb is another attorney. One of the things that Dr. Lemke claimed, for example, was that it was false or misleading to suggest that opioids can improve the function of people who take them. A medical doctor from Stanford argued that there was no function to painkillers, that they didn't help people.
Right.
And we had her admit very clearly, very plainly, that not just the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, but the state of California itself in its own laws acknowledges that opioid medications, when properly prescribed, do in fact improve function. Every use of a medication has, well, what are its benefits and what are its drawbacks? And somehow she was in a position of claiming that painkillers have no function. It's just to state what the head of, what any doctor would say this. And she's an expert. We'll talk more about how much of an expert she is. A second commentary discussed, Lemke testified that 1 in 4 patients prescribed opioids would become addicted. When I look up, I'm not reading, obviously, from the interview. When I get off the plane in New Jersey, I get on a train and it says 1 out of every 3 people who are prescribed opioids becomes addicted. She claims, or perhaps it says 1 out of 4. And then there's on Times Square, the most viewed place in the country, they have a constantly flashing sign saying something similar. 25% or a third of all people prescribed opioids become addicted.
This is something I caught when I was on the drug task force, whatever it was called, the task force here in Burlington, which I eventually quit because of things like this. And I asked that question, well, where'd you get that number from? And no one would really answer me. And I had to look it up, and you can work backwards and fudge this data a little bit and say that, look at all these people who are addicted and then ask if they've been prescribed opioids in the past. And then you can get a number like 25% that these people who are addicted were prescribed opioids at one point.
Because of all the people who were addicted, 25% have been prescribed opioids.
have been at some point.
That's not an actual study. An actual study is, let's look at the population of people who are given opioids.
Right. See what happens to them.
See how many become addicted.
Right.
As defendants point out, the studies relied upon by Dr. Lemke for that conclusion are inadequate to support it. Dr. Lemke, a professor and the head of the addiction program at Stanford University, was relying on data that don't support her case to go out in the world. She wrote a bestseller. The more reliable data would suggest that less than 5% rather than 25%. But either way, addiction based solely on the patient and been prescribed opioids does not occur in most of these patients. Hulu, Netflix, did I say Hulu?
It's Hulu.
It's Hulu. Netflix has its own film, which interviewed Dr.
Oh, right.
And I'm going to talk about that. And Hulu released grabs, and one, shows the actor Michael Keaton supposedly representing a real doctor who was a consultant, saying, they said it was 1%, but it was most of my patients. And he was an Appalachian doctor. So when you do a study, I would say the figure is 1%. They say less than 5% is what the epidemiological database is. Less than in the low single digits of people become addicted when prescribed opioid prescriptions.
And that's just before you even do the courtesy task or the noble or honest task of figuring out of that percentage what's going on with him. I mean, it just gets single digits at a cursory glance at what's going on with people.
Talk about it in regard to Vietnam. Well, who are those people who become addicted? And we're having a conversation now that could get you disabled. I was approached to consult with the drug companies, and I said, well, I'm not going to testify at a trial. Some guys did testify at a trial. I thought I had the most guts in the world, but there were some guys who were willing to get up there and speak the truth. They tend to have jobs. Mm-hmm. Carl Hart, they're not going to go and fire a professor at Columbia. And one of these guys is a professor at Columbia. Cobb is another attorney. It's an extraordinarily methodical order. He goes through every alleged statement after every alleged statement that was made by the drug companies and reaches the findings that these are not false statements. We went into trial every day and we thought, we've got to go out there. We have to be the best lawyers in the room. We have to put forward the best evidence. People hate lawyers, I guess. Obviously, there's some smart lawyers. And obviously, there's some scrupulous and capable lawyers who were more attentive to what the actual information is than people being presented as addiction experts. To be able to push aside the noise and the politics and the hype around trying to find liability for manufacturers and to winnow it down to a focused case on the facts. So Lemke was the lead force for the plaintiffs. She was shown to be both callous about the purpose of painkillers and to misrepresent the likelihood of a person who took opioid painkillers to become addicted. So I'm just going to break it down into what the court found. There was no causation. There was another part of his order where he said there's no causation, which is another big part of our case. In the examination, one John Houston did of our economist, we proved that there's no causation, even though it wasn't our burden in the first place. When you come into, I was a lawyer, when you come in and sue somebody, you have to say, A, they did something wrong, and B, that caused my problem.
The onus is on you to, right.
But we did it anyway. And here's one of those guys who's got some guts. through Dr. Justin McCrary, a professor from Columbia Law School. They contextualize it. What do we mean by contextualize it? Well, when you look at a person and then they say, well, look, they took the drug, they become addicted, you have an obligation to say, well, who were they and what was their situation? We did hear during the trial at times that there isn't a massive crisis in these 4 jurisdictions. There are people who get addicted to painkillers in California, but they don't take video crews to California to show. They go to West Virginia or Tennessee, if you know what I mean. That argument hasn't been used in other major opioid trials. Did it contribute to the problems you had here? We wanted to make sure that a case about the opioid epidemic in California actually related to California. And what we wanted to do was to anticipate and blunt the attack from the plaintiffs that California is like, we're not putting these places down, but all you have to do is read the data put out by the CDC, and you'll see there are hotspots for everybody knows that. Attack from the plaintiffs that California is like Appalachia and Tennessee or some other notorious hotspots. And so we did contextualize that for the judge. They're suing in California, and well, of course, the doctor in Dopesick is in Appalachia. Our prescribed
and she was thinking that she could just, I'm sorry, there's a little lag time. Sorry for interrupting.
Did you want to say anything more? Or?
Yeah, I'll throw it in if it's okay.
Fine.
Okay.
Prescribed meds, the cause. That's what they're suing them. This dispute in the trial was, in these jurisdictions, is this crisis of prescription opioid medications? And you saw during the trial repeatedly us making the point that what has led to many more emergency department visits, more bad outcomes, has been the use of heroin and the use of fentanyl, not the use of prescription opioids. Why would we say that is?
That there are more emergency room visits from people using an illicit drug rather than a prescribed drug. I mean, who's getting pure heroin out there? I guess would be the question you'd say.
So they're taking street drugs,
right?
And these other people are under medical care,
right?
And they have a prescription. I mean, you don't need to be a top flight scientist or legal mind to say, well, that's generally going to keep things under wraps.
And Sam Quinones from Dreamland would say something like, when I dove into my research, what I didn't realize was some of these drugs that are being prescribed are just like heroin. They've got the same chemical makeup as heroin. And, you and I might say,
still.
Exactly. And it's pure.
That's what Carl Hart says, well, they're all opioids.
Right.
And, heroin has a bad name. But if I take heroin, and which he does, I'm a professor and I have, a family life and a regular, and I stay in shape. That's not like the typical person who's using heroin out in the street, which we're going to get back to a little bit more later around Vietnam. The right to pain relief. This is really painful.
So this is another item. Sorry, so you're highlighting a right to pain relief is another pillar on which
the defense lawyers said, well, here's how we won.
Right.
Anna Lemke, being a loss leader, there's no causation. Contextualize. Well, wait a second. Who are we talking about? Are prescribed meds the cause? That's what they're suing about. And the right to pain relief. There's another item that we haven't fully addressed. These are the attorneys being interviewed. It was critical to our strategy to ensure that the voices that are in support of proper pain management were heard. Pain doctors aren't on board for restricting pain medications. You recently testified in Oklahoma, and one of the doctors wrote you a note saying, thank you so much. You were talking about addiction. Mm-hmm. He's a pain doctor, and this is why he thanked you. Pain management doctors who could help describe the life crises of people who simply have inadequate treatment of pain. And the legislative processes behind that to protect that was key to balancing the narrative. You know, people are in pain, and it's hard to judge why people are in pain. You know, you can't go out and say, oh my God, you know, they're not really in pain. They don't need as much pain medication. And they have laws passed so that people can get adequate pain medication. That's the legislative process. And that approach succeeded, and it's shown in the judge's opinion as he sets forth not only the understanding of that balance by the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and the federal government, but how that is enshrined specifically in California in the Patient's Bill of Rights. When you go in, you know, they say, well, these are your rights. You have a right to know your diagnosis, what the alternative treatments are. Right. You have a right as a human being, when you're treated in a medical context, to have your pain addressed, which is like, well, that's like civilization. Why would that not be true? Ann Lemke, the doctor. So we did not see, well, let's stick to the pain issue. Ann Lemke was canceled by a pain patients conference. We are writing to let you know, this is an email that was sent out, that the webinar Understanding Pain and Pleasure presented by Ann Lemke has been canceled. And they're called creaky joints. I guess that's sort of like a joke. There are people who are in pain for, you know, maybe some of them just have arthritis. Again, it's not for me to say they just have arthritis. People say, I hurt. So many of us in creaky joints live with chronic disease and pain, and we understand how some of Dr. Lemke's previous works and comments can be problematic. So a bunch of people, when they invited her, said, we don't want her. She's against us. That came out in the trial. Mm-hmm. Our hope had been that Dr. Lemke's recent work on the connection between pain and dopamine could be helpful for many of us seeking ways to manage chronic pain. However, we failed to properly vet this speaker. So let's go back to dopamine. That's our big shtick. We've already done a podcast and people can refer to it. Joe Rogan, she's written a bestseller about pain, and it's called Drug Dealer MD, How Doctors Were Duped, Patients Got Hooked, and Why It's So Hard to Stop. Ann Lemke is an American psychiatrist who's the chief of Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis at Stanford. She's a specialist in the opioid epidemic in the US. So Joe Rogan interviewed her about her new dopamine book. Dopamine's the source of all addiction. You and I have already gone through that. I wrote a blog post about it that people can look up at the Life Process Program site. That got a lot of exposure. Dopamine is Drek. That's a medical term. No, it's a Yiddish term. I mean, dopamine is a neurochemical released supposedly when people experience pleasure. And you see they jump to the idea, well, then people become dependent on that need for pleasure. But there's 10,000 things wrong with that. Well, let me name 3 things that are wrong with that expression. A lot of things produce pleasure, but not many people become addicted to them. Right. 2, they're claiming that all the things they don't like cause dopamine addiction. But you can't, you know, alcohol doesn't have a specific opioid, a specific brain receptor. Heroin does, but cocaine, meth, and marijuana all operate through different receptors. So the idea, well, look, dopamine causes pleasure, you become dependent on pleasure, all these things produce pleasure, you become addicted to it. It just doesn't pass any kind of biological neuroscientific test. And then the third thing is, well, people get better. Her whole line of reasoning, which I'll describe soon, is that, well, once you become addicted, that's Norovoko's line, or it used to be, well, then you can't quit. You lose your ability to regulate because you need that pleasure. But the main argument against that is people generally all get better.
Let me tell you a really quick story, case study of someone opposite of Lemke, I think. There was a woman on the panel at the legislative hearing that I spoke at named Dr. Beth Darnell. She's also at Stanford, and she does pain management at Stanford. She's a psychologist. And she sort of bought into all of this whole narrative, I guess. So her intent at first was, all right, how do I help pain patients get off of their opioids and find other ways of managing their pain? And, she doesn't prescribe or anything like that, but the idea was, since people shouldn't be on painkillers, let's figure out other things they can do. So she got into research about how, cognitive therapies can help work, certain types of body movement. And then she recognized that her patients were coming back to her suffering. And so she pivoted and she thought, well, how can this be? This isn't my understanding. This is, I haven't actually talked to Beth personally about this yet, but this is from what I see. And she looked out at a breadth of literature to say, or worked with her cohort because she thought, is this something I'm doing? That my patients are all coming back suffering. And then she realized, motivated by her patients and their well-being, that the story doesn't add up. So she did a complete 180 on this and thought, the opioids don't addict people. This isn't just, it's all circumstantial. That gets a 10 out of 10 in my book. That's something that Anna Lemke is not capable of doing right now.
Despite having been unveiled in court, I don't know how many side stories we have a time to talk about, but
that felt important.
I've written a memoir, and I don't know if a number of unusual things have happened to me. One last time I was in Europe, I was on a plane coming back from London, and I was in business class, and I was sitting next to a guy who ran a pain clinic in West Virginia. And I said, that's impossible. Have I been put in the, he actually was in some other state. I'm a little vague on those states that bordered on West Virginia. And he did what she does, find alternative ways for having pain, managing pain. I say, that's fine. Who could be against that?
Right.
But this guy maintained, he was a physician, that had to replace all of painkillers. And I said, that you are a doctor and you believe that they're going to be able to replace all painkiller. And I said, well, how many people do you have at your clinic? And it was like roughly 20. And of course, they're always dropping out. That's just people. People should all master yoga and they're not going to. But we have both confessed that we haven't watched Dope Sick, but I did watch the program where Lemke was presented as the expert. I watched The Pharmacist on Netflix. And there's a guy, a pharmacist, of course, the whole thing's a non sequitur. His son was killed by a crack dealer in New Orleans. So that part of the film is real. And it's very touching. He investigates it himself. He finds a witness who herself was a crack dealer. And to testify in a trial in New Orleans, where he, as the movie claims, the police force is inept and corrupt. Mm-hmm. And you have to have guts. And the woman was scared shitless about doing it, but she was a Christian and she went to her father, and her father said, Jesus will protect you. The truth will set you free. And so she testified in the trial. Come to the end, she had to leave New Orleans. That was not a safe activity to do. And she testified that a crack dealer had said that Scarface had killed the guy's son, and the police reported that to the man. And it turned out that Scarface was in prison. It would take 2.5 minutes to find out that Scarface didn't kill her son, not because he was a great guy. And the guy who reported him was the one who killed him. And this is 20 years ago. He's now out of prison, and he's an honest guy, and he confesses all he's done. He says, I don't know if I'll ever be able to recover from it. And the woman herself, a crack addict, quit being a crack addict, kind of because she saw herself in a new light. So it's very unletting, but that's not a whole film. So they switched to the opioid crisis and people who peddle opioid pain medications. And so they interview Lemke in the film. And to prove how addictive narcotics are, opioids are, she talks about the Vietnam experience. And she leaves it like that. Well, that proves that's another narcotic episode of epidemic because, you know, a lot of soldiers became addicted. And that was what she said. I'm going to take a little side trip now. Can you see this thing?
Yeah, we can see the image.
Can you see a headline?
You're gonna have. I can sort of see it. Can't quite make it out.
Lessons learned and lost from a Vietnam era study of addiction. Can you see some chicken scratch at the top of it? I'll read it. Can you guess who wrote that chicken scratch? It's not me.
It's not you. Was it Archie?
This is an article from the Boston Sunday Globe on July 25th, 2021. Archie Brodsky and I,
your co-author and
of an addiction, moved to Boston independently in July of 1971. So this is this article came out in the 50th anniversary of our beginning to write Love and Addiction. What Archie wrote at the top, this is like the belated discovery of Rat Park. The lesson was lost because not enough people paid attention to your and our work from Love and Addiction onward. And you and I have a chapter which was reprinted in The Influence.
Filter.
Our friend Will Godfrey's harm reduction publication, which discusses in detail the Vietnam thing. So an article appeared in Stat, a Boston Globe media company that publishes articles on health. Lauren Aguirre is a science journalist, and she wrote the article. This research has been largely forgotten. That's what Archie's comment was about. We wrote Love and Addiction in 1975. It had been revealed that a large mass of guys had become addicted in Vietnam. By the way, among the misstatements by Lemke, she said that they had been taking opium or smoking opium. Right. A significant number of them were already taking heroin in Vietnam.
Right.
And this research has been largely forgotten. And so she reviewed, and we wrote, in Love and Addiction, we wrote Richard Wilbur, the Assistant Secretary of Defense in charge of health and environment, who was a medical doctor, said, everything I learned in medical school about narcotic addiction, heroin addiction, was proven wrong. That people, once they become addicted, were inescapably, unavoidably addicted forever. That's what a government official whose job it was to supervise all this said. And you're more likely to hear a version of that now in medical school. Well, they can't escape being addicted because we now have the chronic brain disease. So they go back to sociologist Lee Robbins, who was hired to lead the research project. And what they did was they studied all the guys who tested positive, and then they asked them if they'd ever had withdrawal, and that group who had been addicted in Vietnam, they tracked. 8 to 12 months after the soldiers returned to the United States, Robbins and her team conducted confidential interviews and got urine samples. Surprisingly, they learned that heroin use was uncommon, even among those who had become addicted in Vietnam. In the first year back, only 5% had relapsed into addiction. So they were addicted in Vietnam, They came home, they stopped being addicted. And Lemke is citing that as proof of how opioids addict them. Robbins, some critics of the study argued that more veterans would relapse after a longer period of time. The research discovered that only 12% had relapsed at any point after 3 years. The rest had recovered spontaneously without any treatment. The research results were so different from what people expected that the scientific community was skeptical, and the press assumed the study was a Department of Defense whitewash. Robbins wrote that she found, quote, little to justify the view of heroin as a especially dangerous drug. Nobody believes that. What they found it wasn't especially dangerous. Instead, some people appear to be more vulnerable to drug abuse in general. Those who became addicted to heroin in Vietnam were more likely to have had social problems before they arrived in the country and to use marijuana, alcohol, amphetamines, and other substances while there and at home. Of course, that whole thing, Vietnam showed the contextualization that Lemke was testifying wasn't true. That it's the person that you really need to examine. And if you take regular people and say, here's some heroin, and they become addicted, then when you bring them back to a normally enriched environment, they stop being addicted.
That story holds so strong that our, whatever you call it, our current mythology about Shibboleth, about what addiction is, that she was comfortable bringing up Vietnam. She has to know what an opposing study, even if she disagrees with it, has said. She has to know Lee Robbins. I can't imagine she could do this line of work and not be familiar with the study.
The head of the addiction program at Stanford Medical School brings up Vietnam to prove how inherently addicted. By the way, only 20% of the guys who had said that they had taken heroin or an opiate in Vietnam showed up as being dependent.
Mm-hmm.
So that's also in there. Nor did our team's analysis show that heroin use was a response to intolerable circumstances like the stress of war. Veterans who became addicted to heroin began to use it early in their tours of duty in Vietnam, typically before they went to combat. And as Robbins pointed out, more time at the front didn't correlate with a greater likelihood of using heroin. A better explanation, which fits directly into the trial, would be if you have people in deprived environments which have little opportunity for alternative gratification, and that's what was causing them to turn to heroin for solace. Robbins also found that even though some veterans returned to occasional use once they were back home, they did not become addicted again. Why was that?
I mean, why was it? Again, it's context. They came back from a stressful, uncertain experience back to their lives, but they had responsibilities and attractive alternatives to drug use.
Which is 1,000%. That's the case against. And so the lawyers, I didn't bring up Vietnam, but what the data they bring up is consistent with Vietnam, which Lemke herself brought up in The Pharmacist. Certainly our results are different from what we expected in a number of ways, Robbins and her colleagues wrote in 1977. I never met Lee Robbins, but she actually sent me a copy of that study with a note. It is unfortunate, it is uncomfortable presenting results that differ so much from clinical experience with addiction, with addicts in treatment. The evidence for this 50-year-old study is consistent with what we know about substance use disorders today. Polysubstance use remains widespread. That is, people aren't kind of addicted to one thing, they'll take what they can get. And many people recover on their own from drug addiction. Compared with the roughly 20 million people in the United States with active substance use disorders, more than 20 million are in long-term recovery. Most of them did not receive formal treatment. Also, exposure to opioids doesn't inevitably lead to a substance use disorder. Some people can use opioids occasionally without becoming addicted. In fact, a recent analysis found This is in the Globe. It's not like an unknown publication. A recent analysis found that only 3% of the tens of millions of people that prescribed opioids became addicted. So here's somebody writing in a major publication, ignoring my work for the last half century, but let's not be petty. And now it's come out at a time when Lemke's writing bestsellers, ignoring that same information. And she's presented as not only ignoring it, but misinterpreting it in exactly the wrong way. So we've talked about Lemke. Let's just talk about the institutions that were involved. Stanford Medical School presents her as their lead figure addiction expert. Is that unbelievable? Whew. Joe Rogan, who presents himself as a libertarian and who interviewed, as we described, Carl Hart, subsequently interviews Anna Lemke in her dopamine trek, which says, well, dopamine explains why people become addicted to whatever. You would think dopamine more like in cases like cocaine rather than heroin or opioids, because opioids are not fun drugs. They're not dopamine type drugs. Then there's this mass media exposure on Hulu through Dopesick. And then, as I said in our presentation about that, the producer of Dopesick appears on MSNBC, which is a progressive station, in front of, smart people. Joe Scarborough, Mika Brzezinski, Willie Geist is another guy on that program, one of the smartest guys around. And they all go along. And then Nicole Wallace is one of my idols. And on that show, when they show the clip of Michael Keaton saying, most of my patients became addicted, and they all just go along with it. And as you said to me, they've all taken painkillers. Not only have they all taken painkillers, but I believe both Mika Brzezinski and Joe Scarborough have described their children becoming sick and them getting painkillers. So they know people use painkillers all the time. They use painkillers, and they all went along with this trek. And Joe Scarborough said, well, I have a friend, musician, who takes drugs, and he got addicted to painkillers, and that was the worst addiction he ever had. So major medical institutions, major media, and that includes, Hulu, and it includes Joe Rogan, and then major political, critical, social commentators, like the progressive staff at MSNBC. And I'm going to add one other group that we often discuss. You and I published that part. We had an excerpt from our book about Vietnam. You and I haven't been as present lately in the influence.
Filter,
sorry. There are two major thrusts in drug policy reform for addressing the opioid crisis. And those are, one is making naloxone a drug withdrawal, narcotic effects reversal drug. It's an instantaneous emergency drug, which everybody uses around the country. The other two are cutting pharmaceutical prescription of painkillers. And the other one is medication, MAT or MOUD for drug addiction. And they're gung-ho about it. That's the major thrust. And I'm describing groups where people in 2017 present all of the data, and all the charts show drug deaths going up, and all of them are saying, oh, we're limiting painkillers so much in New York City and New York State. And that was true nationwide, 2013, 2017. And I'll present these information at a conference of people who've come to see me, and they've come to see me to dispel addiction myths. And after I present that, I'll say, well, why has there been an opioid crisis? Everybody in this group, and these are sophisticated people, say, oh, a drug manufacturer pushing drugs. And then I present the data that drug prescriptions had dropped sharply, 25% between 2013 and 2017. And they'll say, what's causing it? And they'll just say, prescription medications. They'll just repeat it. It can't be dislodged from their minds. You can't. And so what's your reaction to the fact that 5 major institutions, the medical establishment, libertarian podcasts, popular media, progressive commentators, and drug reformers all doubled down on what was disproved in a legal trial of the actual facts? How do you interpret that?
It's a story that's nice and easy. It has a bad guy. It has a bad guy that even if you're wrong about, you don't really feel bad about being wrong about, because screw them. And with that comes.
They asked me to testify. I wasn't asked to testify for Purdue. I was asked to testify by unnamed pharmaceutical company. I don't know if they're the ones in California. And I said, well, I don't care if they take all the money from Purdue and give it to poor people whose families have had drug fatality. I don't care if they do that. That sounds like a good idea to me. I only want to say what's factual about painkillers. And they're, every Purdue and that guy from Columbia Law School, it's almost like you're testifying in favor of, like, people conceive of them as mass murderers. And he's just saying, well, they didn't cause what they're being claimed to cause.
Mm-hmm.
So they're perfect to be framed for the crime.
And so it's created a situation where you can just say this thing. You can almost read a script, and you'll be lauded for it, and people will say, all right, you're one of the good guys. But you never but it's also created a situation where you could have sued big pharma, pharmaceutical industries, for all sorts of things. Could have sued them for their just devious actions and marketing and ways that they monopolize other companies. You could have done anything, and you could have gotten money from them, and you could have distributed money as people said they were going to distribute. That's a whole nother ball of wax. But so far as they're going to take money and give it to victims or whatever, you could have just done that and not use this narrative. And now it's come back to bite people who believe in it in the ass in this situation.
And what I would say is, I almost began with my introduction by saying, there's a good guy, bad guy story, which is irresistible. The rich family behind Purdue, people love to hate them. But what's going on here is there's an idea. There's an idea of what addiction is, a misrepresentation, a misnomer, a misconception of what addiction is, that pervades our culture, that can't be escaped, no matter how much it's disproven. From Vietnam to this trial, 50 years apart, it'll never be disproven because it's a cultural icon. Everybody buys into it and loves it, including drug policy reformers. And the only small problem with that is we'll never address the problems created if you misidentify the source and the nature of that problem.
Right.
Zach, I'm shift into my Ethan commentary about me now. Do we have? Can I do that?
Go for it.
You say something first. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Well, what you just described, there's a I don't remember who to attribute it to. There's a term that I've heard, I didn't make it up, called idea laundering. So the notion that there's an idea, and like you say, there's a good guy, bad guy. It's and then you get together with people of the same, what do you say, moral intuition. But moral intuitions. and then you get together and kind of, it's almost like you're in a room with that high esteemed academics, and you write on a notepad the ideas that are right and wrong, and then you go and pervade the entire landscape of science and narrative journalism with that idea. And it's not, I'm not a conspiracy guy. I'm not saying someone actually got, there's not a Illuminati that got, of academics that got together, but it's sort of like how it happens. You know, eventually we're all sort of telling the same story, even though there are holes in it. And like you say, people.
Now you're describing the painkiller phenomenon. Now remember, Lee Robbins wrote her original research in the 70s, and she's talking about the heroin myth.
Mm-hmm.
So the heroin myth preceded the painkiller myth. It falls in the same slot. I wrote you an email. It falls in the same slot in our minds, which is there's this big giant beast that can't be controlled. Anybody who says it can be controlled is a villain. Carl Hart's out there saying, well, I take heroin. It's not the villain. It's people's lives, which is what all of this research shows. But we can't be disconfirmed of that. And so
it makes people like you have to sound like you're saying, I don't mind the villain so much, rather than perhaps this person or thing or entity is not villainous, and here's why. You know, it's you can't correct that almost in any sort of rhetoric.
But you can't correct a cultural. It's an embedded belief in the culture. Right. Everybody. So I'm going to do my critique of me by Ethan now.
A real critique, or a critique you?
Well, I'm going to paraphrase.
Okay.
Shannon. Nobody accepts you. You know, I changed Ethan's ideas about addiction when he read my book in 1985, The Meaning of Addiction, where I said heroin does not differ from other experiences that people have, and the tendency for people to flux and flow in their being addicted to it and overcoming it, and the consequences of being addicted and the causes of being addicted. And Ethan said that changed his whole view of addiction early before he created the Drug Policy Alliance. But now he's standing. Nobody takes you seriously anymore. They think you're brilliant and you make great contributions, but you're out in the stratosphere now with these views. But really, and the things that people, you know, everything I predicted about in Love and Addiction, we predicted all the major trends in addiction. That addiction isn't limited to the drugs. That's called process addiction. That most people overcome addiction. That's natural recovery. That harm reduction, that people can lessen their use. Like the guys who returned from Vietnam would use narcotics occasionally, whereas before they had been previously addicted. That social causes are both the causes of addiction and are the remedies for addiction. All of those things are things that I adumbrated a half a century ago. But I'm not bitter. And now, but the same underlying thing, what Stan, and you're preoccupied with one concept, addiction. Guilty as charged. And what I'm saying is our wrong-headed notion of addiction is the underlying source of the medical establishment, popular media, libertarian media, like considering Joe Rogan a representative of that. I mean, obviously, Jacob Solomon, Reason Magazine aren't. Commentary progressive media, as represented by Joe Scarborough and his crew. And even the drug policy reform are embedded, stuck like a tar baby in the muck of a misstated idea of addiction. An addiction is an idea is an incredibly powerful thing. We're going to shift now to another topic. Zach and I both happen to be connected to Northern Ireland in a strange way. Our life process program is hooked up. We're part of an organization, an internet organization that's centered in Northern Ireland. And so we paid a lot of attention, caught my attention. A famous British director, his name Kenneth Branagh, has done a movie which is coming out just now called We're Current Events, Belfast. Belfast is the capital of Northern Ireland. And for Americans who aren't tuned into all of that, the upper third, maybe, of Ireland, the island of Ireland, is called Northern Ireland, and it's actually part of the British UK. It's British. The bottom two-thirds or more is Ireland, a separate nation. Ireland is Catholic. Northern Ireland is Protestant and Catholic, but mainly Protestant. It's state attached to the UK, and that created a ton of bloody violence. And it so happens that Kenneth Branagh, who became a well-known British director, was from Belfast. I don't know if he was Catholic, he might have been. Left Northern Ireland and Belfast because of the bloody fighting when he was very small. And so his movies come out, and the New York Times did an interview with him called November 1st, 2021, Kenneth Branagh is finally processing his childhood trauma. So do you have, before we start, do you have any reaction to the title?
I can't unknow what I know about the article, but I'll just say that, first of all, the idea is that you have to address traumas that have happened to you in some detail. This is the idea, before you can move on in any productive way. And the second part is that the New York Times think that they slyly got Kenneth Branagh to start talking about past traumas, and that's important for some reason.
So you're going to read the interviewer, the New York Times interviewer's questions, and I'm going to be Kenneth Branagh.
So here's
why
the
don't
first.
you start with the first question then?
The first question is, did you and your family ever talk about what you went through in 1969? Feeling you had to leave Belfast for England would have been tough by itself, let alone being compelled to do so by sectarian violence. I'm curious if the emotional ramifications were ever discussed.
Branagh's answer: nobody asked me that before, and to be perfectly honest, I never thought about that. Can you believe that? There's a civilized country where somebody didn't ask him, well, wasn't your whole life traumatized by leaving Belfast? And he said, well, I've never discussed it with anybody, and I never really thought about it. What the hell is the matter with that man? He's absent civil. I'm going to read on now. No, nothing like that happened. And I think it would have been helpful. What did happen was the family unit and the individuals all sort of closed down and went in on themselves. Maybe there was a fear of talking about it. I think my family had to believe that the sacrifice was worth it, and how flawed as a solution it was, or whether it was the right decision, never came up. But it must have been under the surface in a significant way. So he's saying it would be good to process that information, yes, which didn't happen. And he left England and left Northern Ireland, became a successful director, didn't become a heroin addict or an alcoholic despite that. Now go on.
I think that one part is so key where he says, you know, I think my family had to believe that the sacrifice was worth it. Let's just put that out there. People's memory of why they did something that maybe caused suffering.
And we're going to get, and they had to leave. Right. Some people didn't leave. So go on, read the next question.
Which makes me wonder about why you were hoping to, which makes me wonder about what you were hoping to accomplish by making the movie. And I mean personally, not artistically. What were you trying to puzzle out? Perhaps to understand that situation?
The rupture was the most significant event of my personal life. There was a sense that before the mob came up the street, I knew who I was and that I was at peace. From that point onward, a whole series of identities and masks was constructed. What I wanted to do was peel some of those away. It was traumatic. It was a total change of his identity. I mean, he lived in one place and he was okay. But now he switches stream a little to do some self-remembering without indulgence. What's without indulgence? Simply trying to open what had been covered up. Because there's so much of who I am that was formed in that period up to 8 years old and before that riot occurred. But from that moment, there was a guardedness. There was an inability to roll with things in a way that one had done before. You go.
What you're describing is the after effect of trauma.
It's an American talking to a quite brilliant Englishman. Everything in America is trauma, and Kenneth Branagh fails to do it. I hesitate to use the word in the sense that this little story exists in a place among groups of people who had many, many more traumatic experiences. You know, people died. Their relative, well, if they're dead, they're not having trauma. Their relatives died, their sisters and brothers and parents. There was never spoken about, partly because a cardinal sin for my family was to be suggesting that anything you'd been through was worthy of categorizing in such a way. There's no question that being shaken by the events of that time from my very particular 8-year-old perspective was, yes, I suppose you'd have to call that traumatic. So, okay, I didn't do that. My parents didn't do that. I wouldn't do that. I say you have to remember and process the events. You could call it traumatic, but I don't. And yet over the years, I've thought one doesn't have to be doing that, the trauma thing, to go back and try and understand that this was a difficult time, which plenty of other people might recognize as such, not to elicit pity, but to share with them recognition that might be insightful in some way. So what's his message?
If you're suffering, and it's worth acknowledging that, but it might not be worth building an identity around your suffering, especially if there were other people around you who may be suffering worse, who may not have pulled themselves out of it or been able to take a constructive path out of it. He's trying to talk about this thing objectively with the emotional, touch on it that describes what people may have been going through without being self-indulgent. And I think that's...
You could describe everybody in Belfast. Well, he's making a film called Belfast. It's not my trauma, it's Belfast. I haven't seen the film yet. I don't think it's been released yet. It's coming soon. You could say everybody in Belfast was traumatized. Everybody on both sides. People used to go around shooting each other in kneecaps. I don't know. Here's another little side story. Our partner is a man named Dahi Conlon, who happens to be Catholic. And that's the minority in Northern Ireland. He never talks about trauma for himself, or he didn't live in Belfast. One day, I've been there several times. One day we were driving through a town, and when you're an outsider and you're looking at Protestants and Catholics in order, and they have their martyrs' pictures painted on walls, you can't tell the difference, obviously. Well, these are Irish guys. So one day we were driving through a town, and there were posters plastered all over the town. And I said, "What?" I said to him, "What is this?" And he says, "This is a very United Kingdom town. This is a town that's very committed to the union with Britain cause, not the Republican cause." And I don't know if they could look at Dahi Conlon and say, "Oh, that guy's a cow." I don't know that. I said, "Would you slow down a little? You know what I mean? Let's just not get stopped in this town. Do you know what I'm saying?" There's not much of that going on, but it still exists. So anyhow, you could look at that as a cultural problem. And obviously, people died. People were crippled. People were depressed. I mean, there's no getting around that. But Kenneth Branagh doesn't examine that as a personal trauma. He sees it as a social trauma. It had had implications for him that he needed to process, but he never, well, you could call me a trauma victim. He never says that himself, and he doesn't blame anything in particular. He didn't become a drug addict or an alcoholic. He became a successful filmmaker. But like any human being, he needs to process the basis of his identity and the changes that he had to make in an identity. I haven't seen the film. Maybe he's going to say, I had to learn to shift my identity. That helped me to be a filmmaker. He doesn't consider it a disease. So what we're having is a cross-cultural exchange where the interviewer and the New York Times says, well, this is a trauma that will mark you for the rest of your life and create, the whole Gabor Mate thing, every disease known to man, starting with addiction. And Kenneth Ross coming at it as a humanist, looking at it as one human being among many, all of whom have had events, something like this. And all of Northern Ireland had this event that they have to process.
Paul, what is his name? Paul Bloom, you heard of him? He's a psychologist. He was at Yale, and now he's at the University of Toronto. He wrote a book a long time ago called Against Empathy, where he was taking a jab a little bit, but of course saying empathy's good, empathy's nice, empathy's necessary. Major sociopaths could have empathy. That's just understanding what makes a person tick. Sometimes what people are talking about when they say empathy is something more like compassion. And so that's something to also look at. Don't bundle it all up in one. Now he's writing a similar book, which he's kind of poking fun at this concept that people hold dear. And I don't remember the title, but it's something about why our suffering gives us meaning, why suffering can give us meaning. And he says, I'm not necessarily talking about people who've lost a child for no good reason. I'm not necessarily talking about people on their deathbed who have no other option. But I'm talking about the experience of suffering, heartache, traumatic events in our lives. We can spin a tale about those things one way or another, and people tend to take those tales and make them, if left to their own devices, and make them productive. And like there was a reason for those things happening, whether they're right or wrong, it influences what they do. And it's sort of this is not him talking anymore, but I would say it's sort of only the idea that you have to continue to revisit trauma and that you have to give it a negative spin, this new idea that really is besetting people, like telling people you have to look back into this thing that happened and don't forget it's bad and it's going to affect you now. And so that's what this famous British actor and film producer is doing.
And one way to describe that process is in America, we clinicalize all human experience, which has the effect of like making you particular and peculiar. Kenneth Branagh is saying, well, I was one of many and I didn't have it the worst. And second of all, it's making an aberration.
Right.
And instead of looking at it as a normal human experience that many people process, I've said this to you before, in my memoir, A Scientific Life on the Edge, I sort of say, the people I'm closest to, I'm not going to go into, I've all had something.
Mm-hmm.
And I often think if I actually met somebody, you say, well, I've had a perfectly okay background. Really, everything was fine in my family of origin. Everything has been fine since then. Nothing really major in my life has ever happened bad to me. A, I wouldn't have anything in common. And B, I'm afraid I'd find them deathly dull.
Yeah.
And, I like people who've had this experience and overcome it. They're more interesting people. They're more into themselves. They're more empathic. They're more able to feel other people's pain because they've had pain. Again, I don't want to be on record as saying, well, everybody should be addicted, which some of us have been. But what I say is that breadth of experience, that depth of experience, is broadening and necessary in some extent, and even in many ways beneficial. My patron saint in that regard, when they ask Keith Richards,
Mhm.
I don't know, he's about 77 or 78 now.
He's had some bad weekends, yeah.
He's got a nice family. He's been married he's been married about 40 years. He has 2 adult daughters, I think. He describes, well, he used to drive them to high school, and his daughters would say, Dad, don't let anybody see you, they don't want everybody to start bugging them about Keith Richards. And, when he looks back on his famous background, he said, well, that was just part of the experience. Keith Richards is life coach now.
Well, that gets into something that I was just thought about this today. If let's say you're a company and you want to hire a motivational speaker for an event, would you rather have someone whose life has just always been great and they don't have any poor tales to tell about what their past experience is like, or is it more interesting to hire a motivational speaker or someone who can talk about experiences who has had setbacks in their lives and had to overcome them?
I think that's what they do. I think a motivational speaker is, by definition, a human being who's overcome some big obstacle, some pain or trauma, or some deprivation or failure. That's how you get to be a motivational speaker.
Yeah. So
anyhow, I just thought, the cross-cultural translation between the New York Times American interviewer and Kenneth Branagh from Northern Ireland, who came from a traumatized place, and how he views the same exact experience.
And they weren't even, at one point they were inquisitive, like, have you thought about this experience? It must have been traumatic. Then another point they said, okay, that's trauma. They're letting them know. Right. That's so interesting.
And he's sort of dancing back, well, I suppose it is.
Right.
Not like he's going to go back and say, oh my God, I need trauma therapy. That's
right. So, hey, we're not going to make any new friends today, but we hopefully did something good for the world, because we talked about the California lawsuits against pharmaceutical industries and exactly on what basis they found pharmaceutical industries not to be guilty of having caused an opioid crisis. And we talked about Stanford head medical expert or addiction expert Anna Lembke, who we've discussed before, and her testimony being pivotal in that case. We discussed Vietnam and the fact that Anna Lemke, that key witness, used the Vietnam studies, spinning it in a way that says, well, people see how many people were addicted in Vietnam, as opposed to the opposite, which is just obvious. And now how
transient that experience was for them,
right?
Given good facilitative places to come home to.
And of course, you couldn't help yourself when I didn't read that Times article. You're pretty good about reading through the paper and spotting those little stories. And I could see why you couldn't help but to, bring this new trauma story into the fold at the very end here, which.
Well, and, this is an LP. Well, some of these we don't put on LPP, but we're involved in concern with LPP, Life Process Program. And so when there's a film made about trauma or not trauma, as the case may be, the title of the film is Belfast, which is a place that I know.
So let's call it for this one, and we'll have to put more of these up on your channel. We'd like to put ones on your channel, your YouTube channel, rather than the Life Process Program channel, if we feel like we need to hide after the episode's published. It was good talking to you, Stan.
Good talking to you.